Good evening, everyone. Hope that you're staying safe and keeping well. It seems like it's been a while since I've been talking to you, and part of that, the reason for it is that last week I was involved in the PCI Refresh Ministers Initiative, and I thanked the people in Greenbank and Moville Sunday past, and I'll thank you all in Carndona and Malin this Sunday coming. Let me thank you for allowing me to take part in that. That was really beneficial, and I certainly did reap the reward of having a time of being refreshed. This evening we're returning to our Who Are We series, and we're thinking back to our last sermon, which hopefully will be up online soon. There's just a little bit of editing needs done to that. And we're thinking back to that sermon when we opened up Genesis chapters 12, 15 and 17, and we thought about this covenant, this promise that God made with Abraham. And we talked about how this is a promise that we can find our place in. It's a promise that we can be part of. And please do listen to that sermon again to think about, well, what was the promise and how we can be part of it. And as always, if you have any questions or there's anything you're not quite sure of or you'd like me to expand on, please contact me and I'd love to hear from you. Well, at the end of that sermon, we thought about how we're meant to be like Abraham, and we're meant to pass on the promise. We're meant to help others find their place as part of God's promise, to find their place by grace and faith in God's family. And this evening I want to think a little bit more about the practical side of that, the how do we do it? How do we pass it on? And to keep with the alliteration, we're going to stick with the letter P. So the first thing that we can do is we pass on the promise by prioritizing it. We pass on the promise by prioritizing it. We make the promise a priority. Our lives are full of demands, and I've learnt that really clearly since moving up here to Amance all on my own. There's washing that needs done, there's ironing that needs done, there's emails that need responded to, phone calls that need made, sermons that need written, midweeks that need recorded, dinner needs made, and this is just me on my own. So add a family, add a wife, add kids, commitments, and you soon find that your diary gets filled up with this list of demands. And with all of that, though we can never lose our place as part of God's promise if we are His people, we do find that God's promise can get pushed out of our lives. And if it's pushed out of our lives, if it's not a priority for us, then it won't permeate through us. It won't come out of us. It won't pour out of us as we seek to have others find their place as part of God's promise. But how do we prioritize it? Well, it's the same way we prioritize anything. Time, effort, sacrifice. That's become nearly a little mantra of mine in talking to people, where sometimes it's thrown back at me, but time, effort and sacrifice, that's the key to making anything a priority in our lives. And it's a vital part of our faith lives too. You know, we're not only meant to be people who pass on the promise, we're meant to be people who prioritize the promise in our own lives by giving it the most important place in our lives. And that's a start. But then it has to go a step further from not only the promise being a priority, but also passing it on being a priority. For us to be actively and intentionally engaged in passing it on. I know most of us are really fearful when it comes to that, me included. We can maybe think that we aren't smart enough, or we aren't skilled enough, or maybe you think that it's my job, that's what I'm supposed to do. But this is for us all. And we can start small. And we can start at home. Maybe it might be that we simply need to take on board not only the heart command of God as he speaks to his people in Deuteronomy 6:5-7, but God's method too. Listen to what God says to the people here. It's a famous passage that says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise." What is God's method there for passing on the promise? It's talk. It's conversation. For the promise to so permeate in our lives that it pours out of us, that what comes out of our lips is saturated by this promise. In that little excerpt from Deuteronomy, there's a focus on parents passing on the law to their children, but that doesn't mean it's only for blood parents. We should think of this in spiritual parental terms too. That the older, the more mature, the more well-seasoned disciples pass on the wisdom and experience of the faith. This might be the next step for you. And it might simply be striking up a conversation that you'll talk with someone. You'll talk to others about faith. So here's a way to prioritize passing the promise on. To have the promise find its place as it pours out of your life and off your lips. That intentional seeking out Christian conversation, that leads us on to our second way of passing on the promise, that we pass on the promise by pursuing others. The other Sunday, as we were thinking about this, we were particularly focused in on our children because of how for us as Presbyterians, the sign and seal of the new covenant has moved from circumcision to baptism, and how Peter in his sermon in Acts says that the promise is for you and your children. And as we thought about that, we thought about how if we are to pass on the promise, particularly to our children, that means they have to be part of us and they have to be present with us. And for that to happen, well, we actually actively have to pursue them. It's not going to be good enough to just open our doors and expect people to come. The Great Commission of Matthew 28 isn't simply wait and see, it's go and make. And so the question we need to ask of ourselves, to think about, is whether we are actively engaged in pursuing future people of the promise. Are we going and making, or are we waiting and seeing? And this pursuit, on one hand, should be personal. That we get to know someone, we build a relationship with them, and as we do that, we're able to extend an invitation for them to come into our lives, come into our homes when COVID permits. And then when things start to open up more, we can extend an invitation maybe that their first interaction with us is to come to Bible study, and then extend an invitation to church. Or maybe it is just that we extend an invitation to church already, invite them to come. But it's not only that it should be personal, this pursuit, it should also be prayerful. That we will hand all of these people over to the God who has made wonderful promises. Promises that we rest and take strength and heart in. Not least that his Son said that he would lose none of whom the Father had given him, and that his sheep would hear his voice. This prayerful pursuit, I think, is really wonderfully told in the story of D.L. Moody. How during his lifetime he kept a list of 100 people that he would pray to come to faith. And during his lifetime, 96 out of that 100 came to embrace the promise of God. But that's not the end of the story. Because during D.L. Moody's funeral, the final 4 came to faith. They embraced the promise. Those people were prayerfully pursued in the promise. And by God's faithfulness and his grace, they find their place in it. So lastly then, a way in which we pass on the promise and do this practically is with an encouraging push. Let me ask you this. When you were younger, did you ever have to be persuaded or coerced into going to church? Every Sunday, did you get up and say to yourself, I'm full of the joys of Sunday and I can't wait to go to church. I'm just so longing to go there. Or did you have to be maybe pulled out of your bed and pushed out the door? And you don't need to have the excuse of youth to be in that stage or be a teenage rebel. It can be how all of us feel at times. Our hearts can be weary with the world. We can be weighed down, and we don't jump for joy at the thought of getting up and getting out to go to church on Sunday. And maybe even more because it's not the same. You know, we have to wear masks, we can't sing. Maybe we are genuinely scared of COVID. It might be that all we need is an encouraging push. Maybe we need to be the receiver of one. Maybe we need to be the giver of one. I think particularly of you parents, and I don't want to put more weight on your shoulders, but I think of how in particular there is a need for you to maybe gently or not so gently encourage and gently push your kids to come. After all, if I sat down and asked you, what do you want for your kids? Or what do you want for your family, your friends? All of us would respond with what I hope would be a list of only good things. Well, there's no better thing, there's no greater thing than the godly, than the relationship of God with his people. No better thing than God's people finding their place in his promise. And for them to find their place, they need pursued by us, and sometimes they do need given an encouraging push in the hope that by God's grace and by faith they'll find their place. Let's face it, people do need a push at times. More often than we'd maybe like to admit, we avoid the good, the things that we know are good. And maybe even more than we'd like to admit, we avoid the godly. My tongue-in-cheek sort of joke about this is that I'm 32 and I still gravitate towards what isn't good for me. I shouldn't be allowed still at 32 to choose my own diet with the way that I gravitate towards things. And my spiritual food is much more serious. And yet I know I can still struggle to gravitate towards the good. And so there can be times when even I need an encouraging push too. So let me encourage you to think about all of this, about your part in finding people find their place in the promise. Think about your promise priority. Where does the promise sit on your list of priorities in life? Think about your people pursuit. Are you actively going out there after people? Are there people you could and should pursue? And lastly, think about whether there's somebody who maybe needs an encouraging push and you could be the one to do it. Thanks as always for joining with me. Look forward to seeing you again on Sunday as we continue to enjoy being able to meet for in-person worship. Let me, as always, encourage you, if you need to, make contact with me. But for now, stay safe, take care, and God bless.